Hello everyone, welcome back to Insomnia Protocol. Tonight, we have another terrifying horror story for you. Before we start, please subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and leave a comment below. Now, get ready, and let's dive in. I work at a thrift store called Secondhand Sun on the east side of town. The kind of place with a bell over the door that never rings quite right, always half a second late like the sound, is thinking about whether it wants to happen. I took the job in March because I needed something that paid weekly and did not ask too many questions about the gap in my resume. And the owner, a tired woman named Marlene who smelled like clove cigarettes and Windex, did not ask any questions at all. She just handed me a laminated sheet of paper on my first day and told me to read it before my first closing shift. And I remember laughing a little because I thought it was a joke, some kind of hazing thing new employees get handed, like the fake list of rules you give the new guy at a restaurant. I stopped laughing about a week in. The store itself does not look like much from the outside, just a squat brick building wedged between a laundromat and a shuttered nail salon, with a hand-painted sign that has faded so much you can only really read the word Scaudi anymore. Inside it smells like every thrift store smells, old paper and mothballs, and the ghost of somebody else's laundry detergent. And there are aisles of clothes on rolling racks, shelves of dishes and lamps and paperbacks, a corner with furniture nobody ever buys, and a back room where donations pile up faster than anyone can sort them. Marlene runs the place with her husband Denny, who mostly stays in the back doing inventory and does not talk much. And then there is me, hired to run the front counter 3 evenings a week and every other Saturday. The first 2 weeks were boring in the specific way retail jobs are boring, folding shirts, pricing mugs, telling people no, we do not have a bathroom for customers. I did not think about the laminated sheet at all until my 3rd week, on a Thursday night close, when a woman came in 20 minutes before we shut the doors, carrying a garbage bag full of clothes she wanted to donate instead of sell. Marlene was not there that night. It was just me, and I told the woman thank you and set the bag behind the counter to sort later. And she left without saying much else, which I remember, because most people who drop stuff off like to explain why they are getting rid of it. Like they need you to know the coat still fits fine, they are just moving, that kind of thing. She did not explain anything. She just left. I did not think about it again until I was sorting the bag around 9, tagging items with the little gun that shoots a plastic barb through the fabric. And I pulled out a man's flannel shirt, dark green and red plaid, heavier than it should have been for its size. And when I lifted it up to check the collar for a size tag, the smell hit me. Not a bad smell exactly, not like garbage, more like the smell of a basement that floods every spring. Wet dirt mixed with something sharper underneath it. Something that made the back of my throat go tight. I remember standing there holding the shirt for a second, the pricing gun already halfway up to the tag. And that was when I actually thought about the laminated sheet for the first time since my first day. I had shoved it in the drawer under the register and mostly forgotten it, but something about that smell made me go dig it out right then, standing there with the shirt still in one hand. And I found the line about clothing that smells like formaldehyde or damp earth, and I remember reading it twice because I did not want to believe it applied to what I was holding. But it did. It applied exactly. I am not a superstitious person. I want to say that clearly because I think it matters for understanding why I did what I did next, which was follow the rule anyway. Even though every part of my brain was telling me this was insane, that I was a grown adult about to hide a shirt in a lead-line bin because of a piece of laminated paper, that Marlene was probably messing with new hires, and this was some kind of long con I was falling for. But my hands were already moving before my brain finished arguing with itself. I carried the shirt to the bin under the counter, the one I had noticed on my first day, and assumed was for hazardous cleaning supplies, and I lifted the lid, which was heavier than a bin lid has any right to be. And I dropped the shirt inside and closed it, and clicked the little padlock shut, and only after I heard the click did I feel my shoulders come down from somewhere near my ears. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself the smell was mold, that the bin was probably for mold-contaminated items, that there was a boring explanation for all of it, and I had just let a strange first week get under my skin. I finished sorting the rest of the bag, which was just normal clothes. A couple of sweaters, some jeans, nothing that smelled like anything but fabric softener, and I priced them and hung them, and by the time I was done I had mostly talked myself back down. Then I heard something shift inside the bin. Not a loud sound. A small one, like fabric settling, the kind of noise you would not notice at all if you were not already standing 3 feet away staring at the thing making it. I stood very still and listened, and it did not happen again, and I told myself it was the shirt settling from being folded. Cloth does that. It shifts when you drop it somewhere, and that was a perfectly normal thing for cloth to do. I locked up 15 minutes later and did not look at the bin again before I left, and I want to be honest that I walked to my car faster than I needed to, and I sat in the driver's seat for a full minute before I trusted my hands enough to put the key in the ignition. The next morning I came in for my Saturday shift and the bin was still locked, exactly how I left it. And Denny was up front for once, unpacking a box of ceramic figurines, and I asked him, as casually as I could manage, what was actually in the lead-lined bin under the counter. He did not look up from the box. He just said, in a voice that did not have much feeling in it one way or the other, that I should read the sheet again if I had questions, and that some of it isn't ours to explain. It's just ours to follow. And then he asked me to help him unload the rest of the figurines, and that was the end of the conversation. I read the whole sheet again that night, all 7 rules, sitting in my car in the parking lot before my shift instead of inside where I usually kept it in the drawer. And by the time I finished reading, I understood that this job was not what I thought it was when I took it, and that I had 2 more rules waiting for me before the night was even over. Though I did not know that yet, not until the mirror came in around 6:30, wrapped in a moving blanket, carried by a man who would not meet my eyes when he handed it over the counter. The man who brought in the mirror did not want money for it. I remember that detail specifically because it was the first strange thing about the whole transaction, before the mirror itself even became a problem. Most people who bring in furniture want at least a little cash, even at a thrift store, even for something old and scratched up. But this man just set the moving blanket-wrapped bundle on the counter, told me it was a mirror, and said I could have it for free if the store would just take it off his hands tonight. He said the word tonight like it mattered, like there was a difference between me taking it tonight and me taking it tomorrow. And I noticed that, but did not ask about it, because by that point in the job I had learned that asking questions sometimes got me answers I did not actually want. He was maybe 60, thin in the way people get thin when they stop eating regular meals, wearing a jacket too heavy for the weather, and the whole time he stood at the counter he kept glancing toward the front window, like he expected someone to be standing outside it. I asked him if he wanted a receipt for the donation, and he said no, quickly, like the question itself bothered him. And then he left without saying goodbye, walking fast toward a car parked crooked at the curb, and he did not look back at the store once. I stood there with the blanket-wrapped mirror leaning against the counter and thought about rule number 2 before I even unwrapped it, which tells you something about where my head was at by then. Cover the surface with a black cloth before putting it on the display aisle. I remembered we kept a roll of black fabric in the back room, the kind used for photography backdrops, folded up in a box marked mice that I had walked past a dozen times without ever wondering what it was actually for. I went and got the black cloth first, before I even peeled back the moving blanket, because some instinct in me did not want to see my own reflection in that glass even for a second longer than necessary. When I finally did pull the blanket away, just enough to check the frame for a price tag, the mirror underneath was old, gold leaf frame with the paint flaking at the corners, oval-shaped, the kind of thing you would see in a movie about a wealthy family 100 years ago. The glass itself was clean, no cracks, no fog, nothing wrong with it that I could see. I did not look directly into it. I kept my eyes on the frame, on the tag gun in my hand, on anything except the reflective surface, and I got the black cloth over it in under 10 seconds, which felt like a small victory at the time. I carried it to the display aisle near the back of the store, where the furniture nobody buys sits collecting dust, and I set it against the wall next to a dresser with a missing drawer, still covered. And I want to say I felt fine about it after that, but I did not sleep well that night, and I kept thinking about the man's jacket, too heavy for the weather, and the way he kept looking at the window, like something outside was more frightening than whatever he was carrying inside. Marlene was back the next day, Sunday, working the register with me for the first time in almost 2 weeks, and I decided to ask her about the mirror while we were both restocking a shelf of ceramic mugs near the front. I asked her if people ever came back to buy things back, and I framed it like a normal question, like I was just curious about store policy. But she looked at me for a second too long before answering, the way you look at someone when you are deciding how much of the truth they can handle. She told me some people do come back, and when they do, I am not supposed to help them, and I asked her why, and she set down the mug she was holding and said something I have thought about almost every day since. She said the things people bring in here, they do not always belong to the person carrying them. Sometimes they belong to something else, and once a thing crosses that counter and gets tagged and shelved, it stops being anybody's business but the store's, and the people who come back are not usually looking for a refund. They are looking for a way back to something they lost, and it is never our job to help them find it. I asked her what happens if I do help them, and she picked the mug back up like the conversation was over and said, "You will not want to know." And that was all she gave me. I did not push it. By that point, I had learned that Marlene answered exactly as much as she wanted to, and no amount of asking again got you further. That night was my closing shift, and I was alone in the store from 7 until close, which was normal for a Sunday, and around 6:40 I was walking past the display aisle to grab a lamp a customer wanted to look at, and out of the corner of my eye, I noticed the black cloth on the mirror had slipped, just slightly, just enough that a strip of gold frame and a sliver of glass showed along the bottom edge. I remember stopping and staring at that little sliver of exposed glass for longer than I should have, because in the dim light of the back aisle, I thought I saw something pass across it, quick, like a shape moving through a room on the other side. I did not touch it. I did not adjust the cloth. I remembered the rules said cover the surface, not keep the cloth perfectly straight, and some part of my brain reasoned that as long as most of the glass stayed hidden, I was fine. But I stood there for probably a full minute, just watching that thin exposed strip, waiting to see if it would move again, and it did not while I was looking directly at it. I helped the customer with the lamp, rang her up, and watched her leave, and the whole time I kept glancing back toward that aisle like I could feel it behind me, even when I was facing the front door. Around 8:30, with no customers in the store, I finally worked up the nerve to walk back there and fix the cloth properly, using a broom handle to nudge it back into place without getting close enough to touch the frame with my hands, which felt like an overreaction until I was actually doing it, and it did not feel like an overreaction at all. I got the cloth straightened, covering the whole surface again, and I turned to walk away, and that was when I caught my own reflection in the security monitor mounted above the register, the little black and white feed from the camera pointed at the front door. And for half a second, less than half a second really, the image on the screen did not move when I moved. I froze. The image froze too, a beat behind me, and then caught up, my reflected self on the tiny grainy screen lifting a hand at the exact same time I lifted mine, like nothing had happened at all. I stood there staring at that monitor until my hand started shaking, and I thought about rule number 2 again. The second half of it, the part about walking away, and not looking back until my shift ends, and I realized I had been staring at my own delayed reflection for almost 30 seconds before I made myself turn around and walk to the front counter, where I stayed for the rest of the night, ringing up nothing, watching the clock, refusing to look at any reflective surface in that store until Marlene came to relieve me the next morning. And even then I did not tell her what I saw, because some part of me was afraid that saying it out loud would make it more real than it already was. I did not sleep more than 2 hours after that Sunday shift, and when I finally gave up trying and got out of bed around 5 in the morning, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of me and made a decision that felt important at the time, which was that I was going to quit. I told myself I would go in for my Tuesday shift, work it out professionally, give Marlene a week's notice like a normal person leaving a normal job, and then I would never think about secondhand sun again. I want to be honest that this plan lasted exactly until Tuesday afternoon, when I actually walked through the front door and smelled the familiar mothball and Windex smell of the place. And something about that smell made the whole plan feel smaller than it had at 5 in the morning. Less urgent. Like maybe I had overreacted to a tired mind playing tricks on itself after a long shift. Marlene was training a new part-time hire that day, a college kid named Aaron who needed weekend hours, and I watched her walk him through the register and the pricing gun and the donation intake process. And I noticed she skipped the laminated sheet entirely. She did not mention it once, not to him, not in front of him. And when he left for a break, I asked her about it directly, why she had not given him the rules like she gave me. And she told me something that made my stomach drop in a way I was not prepared for. She said not everyone gets the sheet on their first day, only the ones working closing shifts alone, because the rules mostly matter after dark, and Aaron was only ever scheduled for daytime hours, so there was no reason to scare him for nothing. I asked her how she decided who worked closing shifts, and she said Denny made that call, and I did not like the answer because it meant somebody had looked at me on my first day and decided I was the kind of person who could handle whatever the store needed handled at night, and nobody had ever asked if I wanted that responsibility. It had just been assigned to me along with a laminated sheet and a set of keys. That Tuesday night I closed alone again, and everything was quiet until almost midnight. I had already finished my closing checklist, counted the register, turned off most of the front lights except the ones by the door, and I was sitting on the stool behind the counter scrolling through my phone, trying to distract myself from checking the clock every 4 minutes, when I heard the first note. It came from the back shelf, the one along the far wall past the furniture aisle, where Marlene kept a small collection of antique music boxes that nobody ever seemed to buy, ornate wooden boxes with hand-painted lids, the kind of thing that looks nice on a shelf, but that most people do not actually want cluttering their house. I had dusted that shelf plenty of times without a single one of them ever making a sound. And now, at what I would later confirm on my phone was exactly 12:00, one of them started to play. It was faint at first, a thin, tinny melody, the kind of music box sound that always seems to be playing slightly out of tune even when it is not, and I felt my whole body go still in a way that had nothing to do with deciding to be still. It just happened, like my muscles understood something before my brain caught up. I remembered rule number 3 almost instantly. Do not listen to the tune to see which song it is. Grab the nearest heavy object and smash the mechanism to silence it immediately. And I remember thinking in the half-second I allowed myself to think anything at all, that the rule made it sound so simple. Just walk over there and smash it, like that was an easy thing to do at midnight alone in a mostly dark store. But my body was already moving. I grabbed the iron bookend that sat on the shelf behind the register, heavier than it looked, shaped like a sitting owl, and I walked toward the back of the store faster than I meant to walk. And the whole time the melody kept playing. And I want to say clearly that I did not let myself focus on the notes. I kept my eyes on the shelf, on the shape of the box itself. a small green one with gold trim near the end of the row, its lid slightly open, the little mechanism inside turning on its own with nobody having wounded. I did not let the song finish. I brought the bookend down on the box hard once, and the mechanism made an awful grinding crunch sound, gears snapping, wood splintering, and the music stopped mid-note, cut off in the middle of a phrase that I still, all this time later, could not tell you the shape of, because I had refused to actually listen to it. I had only heard it as noise. Background sound I was trying not to process. The silence after that was worse than the music had been. I stood there with the bookend still raised, breathing hard, waiting for something else to happen. Some kind of response to what I had just done, but nothing came. The other music boxes on the shelf sat there exactly as they had before, lids closed, dust undisturbed, like nothing had happened at all, like the one I had just destroyed had never played a note in its life. I swept the broken pieces into a dustpan with shaking hands and did not know what to do with them. So I put them in the same lead-lined bin under the counter where the flannel shirt still sat locked away, because it felt like the safest place in the building for anything I did not understand, and I locked it again and stood there for a long moment with my palm flat against the lid, like I was checking that it was really closed, really secure, even though I had just watched myself lock it. When Marlene came in the next morning, I told her what happened. The whole thing, the melody, the bookend, the silence after, and she listened without much visible reaction, which by now I understood was just how she processed things. And when I finished, she asked me one question. She asked if I heard which song it was. I told her no, that I had made sure not to listen, and she nodded slowly and told me that was good. That was the right call. And I asked her what happens if someone does listen, if someone does not smash it in time, and she was quiet for a moment before telling me that the last person who worked my position before me had worked here almost 8 months, and that he stopped showing up one day without any notice. And when Denny went to check on his apartment, the landlord said he had moved out weeks earlier without telling anyone, packed up in the middle of the night, and nobody at the store had heard from him since. I asked her if she thought he was okay, and she looked at me for a long moment before saying she did not know, and that some people who work here long enough start humming songs they should not know, and that if that ever happened to me, I should tell her immediately, no matter what time it was, and I told her I would. And I meant it, though even as I said it, and I understood that if it ever did happen to me, I might not be the one who noticed first. Wednesday was my day off, and I spent most of it doing normal things, laundry, groceries, a phone call with my sister where I did not mention any of what had happened, because I did not know how to say any of it out loud without sounding like I needed a psychiatric evaluation. But even folding towels in my own apartment, I kept catching myself glancing at mirrors longer than I needed to, watching my reflection move exactly when I moved, checking over and over, like I had developed a new tic overnight. Thursday I was back at the store for a closing shift, and Aaron was there for the first half of it, since Marlene had him working an overlap shift to learn the evening routine, even though he was not technically allowed to close alone yet. I liked having him there, honestly, even though I could not explain to him why his presence made the store feel less heavy, less like something was watching from just outside my field of vision. We spent most of the evening restocking a shipment of donated books, and around 7 he asked me, casually, if I had heard anything about this place being haunted, because his roommate used to shop here and told him some story about a customer who swore the mannequins moved. I told him I did not know anything about that, which was a lie, but it felt like the responsible lie to tell a 19-year-old working 4-hour weekend shifts who was never going to be handed the laminated sheet. He laughed it off and said that was probably just customers being weird, and I agreed, and we kept shelving books, and I did not say anything else about it, though I noticed myself glancing at the taxidermy corner more than once while we worked, checking that the glass-eyed animals were still facing the back wall like they were supposed to. Aaron left at 8, and I finished the rest of the shift alone, and by 9:45, I had done my closing checklist early, wanting extra time to get everything locked up well before 10, because something about that night felt like it wanted extra caution, though I could not have told you why at the time. I locked the front doors right at 10, turned the deadbolt, checked it twice, and then I remembered rule number 4 for what felt like the first time in a while, since it was the one rule I had not yet had to use, and some small foolish part of me had started to hope maybe I never would. 5 minutes after I locked the doors, I heard it, a rattling at the front glass, the metal handle shaking against the frame, someone pulling on it from outside, testing whether it would give. I was standing near the back of the store, restocking a shelf of picture frames, and I went completely still the moment I heard it, the same stillness that had come over me during the music box night, my body understanding the danger before my mind finished catching up. I did not walk toward the front. I made myself turn away from it instead, which felt deeply unnatural, every instinct in me wanting to look, wanting to know who or what was standing at my locked door in the dark. But I forced myself to keep facing the shelf of frames in my hands, and that was when the voice started. It was a woman's voice, muffled through the glass, but clear enough that I could make out most of the words. She said please, and then something about needing to come in, just for a minute, and then she said the phrase the rule had warned me about almost word for word, that she just wanted to buy back something she had sold, that it was a mistake, that she needed it back tonight, only tonight, and her voice had this quality to it that made my chest hurt, this raw pleading sound like someone standing at the edge of losing something they could not survive losing. I want to be honest that some part of me almost turned around anyway. Not because I believed her, exactly, but because the voice sounded so much like real grief that some human part of me wanted to help, wanted to unlock the door and let her explain herself and figure out what she needed, because that is what a decent person does when someone is crying at their door. But I remembered Marlene's face when she told me the people who come back are not looking for a refund, and I remembered the missing worker who used to have my job, and I kept my back to the front of the store and reached over to the panel of light switches on the wall, and I turned off the front display lights exactly like the rule said, plunging the front third of the store into darkness. The rattling stopped the moment the lights went off, cut off mid-shake like a hand had simply let go of the handle, and the voice stopped too, right in the middle of a sentence, the word tonight hanging unfinished in the air. I stood there in the dim back of the store with a stack of picture frames still in my hands, listening to nothing, waiting for the silence to break again. And it did not. I did not look at the security monitor. I remembered the rule said not to, and after what had happened with my own delayed reflection the week before, I had no intention of testing that boundary a second time. I finished the closing checklist in near total darkness, working by the faint glow of the exit sign above the back door, and I did not turn the front lights back on until I was ready to leave through the back entrance entirely, avoiding the front doors altogether, even though that meant a longer walk around the building to reach my car. When I got home that night, I could not stop thinking about how specific the voice had sounded, how much genuine desperation had been in it, and it occurred to me for the first time that whatever came to that door was not necessarily lying about wanting something back. It probably did want something back. It probably had lost something real, something that mattered to it, and the horror of the situation was not that it was evil exactly, but that it was desperate in a way that made it dangerous regardless of its intentions, the way a drowning person will pull down anyone who tries to save them, not out of malice, just out of the raw animal need to survive. I thought about the man who brought in the mirror, the way he refused to meet my eyes, the way he said tonight like the word itself was urgent, and I wondered if he was the one at the door, or if he had been running from something similar himself, dropping off whatever he was carrying and disappearing before it caught up to him. I did not have an answer. I still do not. But I started keeping a small notebook after that night, writing down every detail I could remember about each incident, the times, the sounds, the specific words used, because I had a growing feeling that the pieces of this place were connected in ways nobody had bothered to explain to me, and that the only way I was going to survive working there was to start understanding the shape of what I was dealing with, one rule at a time, one broken night at a time, whether Marlene ever decided to tell me the full truth or not. By the second week of my notebook, I had filled almost 15 pages. Times of incidents, weather that night, whether the moon was visible, which employees had been in the store earlier that day. Small details that felt meaningless on their own, but that I hoped might add up to something if I kept collecting them long enough. I am not a naturally organized person, but something about writing things down made the fear more manageable. Like turning it into data instead of memory made it smaller, more like a problem to be solved instead of a thing that had happened to me. I noticed the first pattern almost by accident. Looking back through my notes, every incident so far had happened on a night following a day when Denny had been sorting new donations in the back room. The flannel shirt, the mirror, the music box, the woman at the door. All of them had come in or activated within 24 hours of a donation intake day. I brought this up to Marlene on a slow Friday afternoon while we were both folding a rack of sweaters, trying to sound casual about it, and she stopped folding for a moment and looked at me with an expression I had not seen on her before, something between surprise and a kind of tired respect. She told me I was not wrong to notice that, and that the store did not create any of what I had been experiencing, it only collected it, the way a drain collects whatever gets poured down it. She said some of what people bring in here still has something attached to it, something that followed the object home from wherever it came from originally, and that most of the time those things stay quiet, dormant, sitting on a shelf for months without incident. But every so often something comes in that is not finished yet, something that still wants to go somewhere or find someone, and those are the donations that cause trouble. I asked her how she could tell the difference between an object that was finished and one that was not, and she said honestly, most of the time you cannot tell until it is already a problem, which is why the rules exist, not to prevent the trouble from happening, but to survive it once it starts. I asked her why she kept accepting donations at all, if this was a known risk, and she got quiet for a second before telling me that turning donations away caused its own kind of trouble, worse trouble, the kind that does not wait for you to lock the doors at night, and that accepting everything and following the rules carefully was, in her words, the lesser of two very bad options. That answer did not comfort me the way I think she meant it to, but I filed it away in my notebook anyway, because it was more truth than she had given me before, and I had started to understand that with Marlene. You took whatever truth she offered and did not waste time asking for more than she was willing to give. That Friday night, I closed alone again, and it was quiet for most of the shift, quiet enough that I almost let myself relax, until I went to do my morning opening duties the next day, since Marlene had asked me to come in early to help with a delivery. I arrived a little before 8, let myself in through the back, and walked toward the front of the store to unlock the door for the delivery truck, and that was when I saw the taxidermy corner. Every single glass-eyed animal on that shelf, the fox, the two owls, the small deer head mounted on a plaque, all of them had been turned to face the aisle instead of the back wall, exactly like the rule described, and standing there in the gray early morning light, with nobody else in the building yet, I felt a cold drop straight through my stomach that had nothing to do with temperature. I remembered the rule immediately. Do not correct their position with your bare hands. Use a broom handle from behind. And I went and got the broom from the closet near the register. My hands not quite steady around the handle, and I approached the shelf the way you might approach something that could still be alive, slow. No sudden movements, though I told myself repeatedly that they were just stuffed animals, dead things, nothing that could actually respond to how fast or slow I moved. I used the broom handle to nudge the fox first, turning it gently by pressing against its side until it faced the wall again, and the whole time I kept my eyes on its glass ones, half expecting them to track my movement. Though they never did, they stayed fixed and glassy and empty the entire time, which should have been reassuring and somehow was not. I did the same with both owls, and then the deer head last, and as I turned that final one, I noticed something I had not seen from the front of the shelf. A thin, cloudy residue on the wood beneath where its mount sat, like something had beaded and dried there overnight. Not quite the deep, viscous fluid described in Rule 7, but close enough to make my chest tighten looking at it. I did not touch the residue. I did not know if I was supposed to, since it was not technically an item bleeding onto the floor. It was just a strange discoloration under a taxidermy mount, and none of my 7 rules addressed something in between like that. I made a note of it in my notebook instead, the date, the time, the exact wording of what I saw, and decided I would ask Marlene about it when the delivery truck arrived and things settled down, because I was starting to understand that the rules I had been given were not a complete map of everything this place could do. They were just the 7 situations someone before me had survived long enough to write down, and there was no telling how many other situations existed that nobody had lived through cleanly enough to document. The delivery truck came at 9, and by the time Marlene arrived at 10, I had almost talked myself out of mentioning the residue at all, worried it would sound paranoid on top of everything else I had already told her. But I made myself say it anyway, and she went and looked at the spot herself, crouching down with a flashlight from her purse, studying it for a long, quiet moment before standing back up and telling me she wanted me to start writing everything down more carefully from now on. Every detail, no matter how small it seemed, because she said something that stuck with me for the rest of that day and honestly for a long time after. She said the 7 rules were not the whole story. They were just the parts of the story that had already been figured out, and that my job, whether I liked it or not, might end up being figuring out the rest. I did not sleep well after Marlene said that to me, and over the next few days I found myself reading through my notebook obsessively, looking for connections I might have missed, trying to figure out what the residue under the deer head could mean, whether it was an early warning of something building toward rule number 7, or something separate entirely that nobody had a name for yet. I did not find any answers in my own notes, but I did find something else, tucked into the back pages where I had started jotting down random observations that did not seem to fit anywhere, a pattern in the donation intake logs Marlene let me help with on slow afternoons. Every item connected to an incident so far had come from a donation drop-off where the person delivering it refused a receipt. The woman with the flannel shirt bag, gone before I could offer her one. The man with the mirror, declining quickly like the question itself scared him. I went back through the store's donation log, a beat-up composition notebook Denny kept behind the counter, and found that in the last 6 months, there had been 11 no-receipt donations, and I recognized 4 of them already from my own experiences. That left 7 I did not know anything about yet, 7 items somewhere in this store that I had not identified, sitting quietly on a shelf or a rack, waiting for whatever made them different to eventually show itself. I brought this up with Denny on a Tuesday afternoon while he was pricing a box of vinyl records, and for the first time since I had started working there, he actually put down what he was doing and gave me his full attention. He asked me why I wanted to know, and I told him honestly that I felt like I was constantly reacting to things instead of understanding them, and that if there were 7 unidentified items somewhere in the store that might cause trouble, I wanted at least a chance to recognize them before they became a problem instead of after. He was quiet for a while, turning a record over in his hands without really looking at it, and then he told me something that changed how I thought about the whole job. He said the reason nobody had ever tried to identify those items ahead of time was not because it could not be done, but because of what happens to people who go looking for trouble instead of waiting for trouble to come to them. He said the rules exist for people who react, who respond to what shows up on its own. And that going hunting through the store, trying to sniff out which items were dangerous before they revealed themselves, was a different kind of risk entirely. One nobody currently working there had any rules for at all. I asked him if he had ever tried it himself, back when he was younger, and something shifted in his face, a tightness around his eyes that had not been there a moment before. And he told me that a long time ago, before Marlene, there had been another employee who tried exactly that, going through donation records looking for patterns, trying to get ahead of things, instead of just surviving them as they came. And that employee stopped showing up 1 week. And unlike the man who worked my position before me, this one was never heard from again in any way. No apartment left empty, no trace of him moving on with his life somewhere else. He was simply gone, and Denny said the not knowing was worse than any of the incidents I had described to him so far, because at least with the rules, you know the shape of the danger, and with going looking for it yourself, you do not know anything until it is already too late to matter. I did not go looking after that conversation. I want to be honest that some curious, stubborn part of me wanted to keep digging anyway, wanted to flip through every donation log and cross-reference every no-receipt entry until I had mapped out exactly where those 7 items were hiding in the store. But Denny's face when he talked about that missing employee stayed with me, and I decided the notebook I kept would be for documenting what happened to me, not for hunting down what had not happened yet. That decision got tested only 3 days later, on a Friday closing shift, when a customer brought in a box of unlabeled cassette tapes just before we closed. An older man who mumbled something about cleaning out his late brother's garage, and who left a receipt request unanswered, because I never got the chance to offer him one. He was gone from the counter before I finished ringing up the donation, out the door and into a car that pulled away before I had even set the box down. I recognized what I was looking at immediately: plain white cassette cases with no labels, no titles, nothing written on the spines at all, and my stomach dropped the way it had every time before, because I already knew which rule this belonged to before I even opened the box to check. I set it aside behind the counter without touching any of the tapes themselves, and I did not go near the store's stereo system for the rest of that shift, not even to lower the volume on the radio Marlene usually kept playing at low volume during business hours, because I did not trust myself to be careful enough while distracted, and I wanted every ounce of my attention available in case something happened that night. Nothing happened that Friday, which felt almost worse than if something had, because it meant the box was just sitting there, waiting, and I had no way of knowing whether it would stay quiet for a week or activate the moment I let my guard down for even a second. I locked it in the back room, instead of leaving it on the sorting table, and I told Marlene about it first thing the next morning, and she nodded slowly and told me sometimes the dangerous ones wait, sometimes for a long time, and that waiting did not mean the box was safe. It just meant its moment had not come yet, and that I needed to remember that every single day I worked near it, because the day I forgot was the day it would choose to remind me. The box of cassette tapes sat in the back room for 11 days without a single sound coming from it. And over those 11 days I found myself checking on it, almost every shift, opening the door to the back room just to look at it sitting there on the shelf where I had placed it, as if looking at it enough times would somehow tell me when it planned to wake up. Marlene noticed me doing this on more than one occasion and told me to stop, that watching it would not change anything and would only wear me down before the real test ever came. But I could not help myself. The not knowing sat in my chest like a held breath I could not release. On the 12th night, a Tuesday, I was closing alone, and Aaron had already left for the evening after his short training shift, and Marlene and Denny had gone home hours earlier since neither of them ever stayed for closes anymore now that I had taken over that responsibility fully. Around 11, with the store quiet and only the register light and the exit signs glowing, I was in the back room counting inventory sheets when I heard it, faint at first, coming from the shelf where the box of tapes sat, a soft sound that took me a moment to identify as a voice. It was not loud. It was barely more than a whisper, coming from somewhere inside the box itself, though the stereo across the room sat dark and unplugged exactly where I had left it, untouched since the tapes arrived. I stood very still in the doorway of the back room, my inventory sheets forgotten in my hand, listening to that whisper without wanting to, and I made out, faintly, unmistakably, my own name, spoken slow and soft, the way someone says a name when they are trying to coax a nervous animal closer. I remembered Rule 6 with a clarity that surprised me given how frightened I was. Unplug the machine and pour salt into the cassette slot if you hear a whispering voice calling your name while the stereo is off. But the stereo was already unplugged, had been unplugged this whole time, and the voice was not coming from the stereo at all. It was coming from inside the closed cardboard box itself, from tapes that had never been played, that had never even been removed from their plastic cases, and for a moment I stood frozen wondering if the rule even applied to what I was hearing, since the specifics did not match exactly what had been described to me. I decided I did not have the luxury of debating semantics with a piece of laminated paper while something was whispering my name from a box 6 feet away from me. I went to the shelf in the front of the store where we kept extra salt for the small kitchenette Marlene used for her coffee, and I grabbed the whole container and I walked back to the back room with my heart slamming against my ribs, and the whisper kept going the entire time, low and patient, repeating my name over and over in a rhythm that felt less like calling and more like counting down. I found the box, and beneath the flaps, I could see the pale plastic edges of the cassette cases stacked inside, and rather than opening each case individually to find whichever tape was making the sound, I did the only thing that felt like it matched the spirit of the rule, even if it did not match the letter of it exactly. I tore open the box flaps fully and poured salt directly over the stacked cassettes inside, a thick white layer covering every case I could see, and the whisper stopped mid-syllable, cutting off on the second sound of my own name, leaving a silence in the back room that felt heavier than the whisper had. I did not move the box after that. I did not touch it again that night at all. I finished my closing duties as fast as I reasonably could, working with one eye constantly toward the back room door, and I left through the back exit like I always did on nights when something had happened, and I called Marlene from my car before I had even started the engine, my hands shaking too badly to hold the phone steady against my ear. She listened to the whole story without interrupting, and when I finished she was quiet for a moment before telling me I had done the right thing, that the salt did not need to touch the tape mechanism directly. It only needed to reach the tapes themselves. The physical object the voice was attached to, and that pouring it over the box had been a reasonable adaptation given the circumstances. She told me not to open that box again for any reason, that in the morning she and Denny would deal with it properly, and I asked her what properly meant, and she said something I wrote down word for word in my notebook the moment we hung up, that some objects can be buried, and some have to be burned, and the box of tapes was going to be the second kind. I did not sleep that night either, lying awake replaying the sound of my own name being called from inside a sealed cardboard box. And I found myself, somewhere around 3 a.m, wondering about the man who dropped the tapes off, the one who mumbled something about his brother's garage and left before I could offer a receipt. I wondered if he knew what he was carrying when he brought it in, or if he was as blind to the danger as I had been on my very first day. Handed something ordinary looking that turned out to be anything but. The next morning, Marlene and Denny were both at the store before I arrived for my shift, and the box of tapes was gone from the back room entirely. No explanation offered beyond a brief mention that it had been dealt with, and I did not ask for details because some part of me understood by then that there were things in this job I was better off not knowing the specifics of, the same way Denny had warned me about going looking for trouble instead of waiting for it to come. I only asked one question: whether the man who dropped it off might come back looking for it. And Marlene told me if he did, I already knew what to do, because it would be no different than the woman who had come knocking at the front door weeks earlier. And some doors, once closed, needed to stay closed no matter how much noise came from the other side of them. After the cassette tape night, I noticed something shifting in myself that I did not like, but could not seem to stop. I had started treating the rules less like a horrifying necessity and more like a strange kind of competence, the way a nurse might stop flinching at the sight of blood after enough time on the job. I caught myself explaining the salt trick to Marlene almost proudly, like I had solved a puzzle instead of survived something that had called my name from inside a sealed box. And when she looked at me after I finished, there was something in her expression that was not quite approval, more like concern dressed up as patience. She told me a few days later, while we were both tagging a fresh rack of winter coats, that the people who last longest at this job are not the ones who stop being afraid. They are the ones who stay afraid the exact right amount. Because the moment you start feeling capable instead of careful is the moment you get sloppy. And sloppy is how the last person who worked my position before me ended up disappearing without so much as packing his own apartment. I told her I understood, and I meant it, but understanding a warning and actually holding onto the fear that makes it necessary are two different things. And I did not fully appreciate that gap until 3 weeks later on a Thursday night that started out like any other. It had been a slow shift, only a handful of customers all evening, and around 9:30, I was restocking a shelf of secondhand kitchenware near the front of the store when I noticed a teapot, white ceramic with a faded blue floral pattern, sitting slightly askew on its shelf, tilted just enough that I assumed a customer had bumped it earlier and I had not noticed. I reached to straighten it, and that was when I saw the thin dark line running down from beneath the lid, trailing over the curve of the spout and pooling in a small dark circle on the wood shelf below it. I froze with my hand still outstretched, close enough that I could smell it now, a thick, coppery smell mixed with something else underneath, something sweeter and wrong, like fruit left too long in a warm room. I pulled my hand back, immediately without touching the teapot at all, and I stood there staring at the dark fluid gathering beneath it, thicker than water, moving slower than water would. And I understood immediately that I was looking at rule number 7, the one I had hoped, the way you hope about things you cannot control, that I would never actually have to use. I did not touch it. I remembered that clearly. Do not clean it up, and every instinct I had wanted to grab a rag, right then out of sheer reflexive tidiness. The same reflex that makes you wipe up a spill the moment you see one. But I kept my hands at my sides and made myself think through the rest of the rule instead. Write CLD in big red letters on the tag, place it outside on the public curb, and lock the shop door from the inside until sunrise. I went to the counter and found a red marker in the drawer where we kept pricing supplies, and I came back to the teapot with my hand, shaking so badly that the letters came out uneven. But I got the word written across the little paper tag, already looped around the handle, SOLD in red block letters, and then came the part I was dreading, actually picking the thing up. I did not want to touch it with my bare hands, though the rule did not specify anything about gloves, so I grabbed a plastic bag from behind the counter and used it like a makeshift glove, the way you pick up something dead you do not want to touch directly, and I lifted the teapot by its handle, careful not to let the dark fluid touch my skin, careful not to tip it further and spill more of whatever was inside it onto the floor or onto myself. It was heavier than a teapot should have been, dense, in a way that made my arm ache almost immediately, like carrying a bag of wet sand instead of ceramic and air. I carried it to the front door, unlocked it just long enough to step outside into the cool night air, and set the teapot down on the curb exactly like the rule instructed, the dark fluid still seeping slowly from beneath its lid, forming a small stain on the concrete that I did not stay to watch develop. I went back inside immediately, locked the door behind me, and turned the deadbolt And then I remembered the second part of the instruction: lock the shop door from the inside until sunrise. And I realized that meant I could not simply finish my closing routine and leave through the back the way I normally would. I called Marlene right then, my voice shakier than I wanted it to be, and explained everything. And she was quiet for a moment before telling me I had done everything right so far, but that I needed to stay inside the store until sunrise, that leaving before then, even through the back door, would undo the protection of locking the front, because the rule was not really about the front door specifically. It was about the building staying sealed with nobody crossing any threshold until daylight returned. She told me she would come as early as she could, and that I should stay near the front counter, away from the windows, and not look outside no matter what I heard. I sat behind the register for the rest of that night. 7 hours until the earliest gray light started showing at the edges of the front windows, and I want to say the hours passed quietly, but they did not. Around 1 in the morning, I heard something scraping slowly against the outside of the front glass, not knocking, not rattling the handle like the woman weeks earlier, just a slow dragging scrape that moved from one end of the window to the other, and back again over and over, for almost 20 minutes before it stopped. I did not look. I kept my eyes on the counter in front of me, on my own hands, on anything that was not the window, and I hummed nothing, thought about nothing, tried to make my mind as blank and uninteresting as possible, because some part of me understood without being told that whatever was outside was listening for a reaction, waiting to see if I would give it one. By the time Marlene arrived just after 6, pale early light finally filling the store properly. The teapot was gone from the curb outside, no trace of it left except a faint dark stain already fading on the concrete. And I never found out what happened to whatever had come to collect it, only that it had come, and that I had survived not looking at it, and that the tightness in my chest did not fully release until Marlene locked the front door behind her and told me gently that I could finally go home and sleep. I took 2 days off after that night, the first time since starting the job that I asked Marlene for time away that was not already scheduled, and she gave it to me without a single question, which told me more about how serious that teapot incident had been than anything she could have said out loud. I spent those 2 days mostly sleeping and mostly failing to sleep, caught in that strange, exhausted state where your body wants rest but your mind keeps replaying the scrape of something dragging itself along a window it could not get through. When I came back for my Sunday shift, Denny pulled me aside before Marlene arrived, which was unusual since he rarely initiated conversation with me at all. He told me he wanted to show me something in the back room, and I followed him past the shelves of unsorted donations to a locked cabinet I had noticed before, but never had reason to open, tucked behind a stack of empty boxes near the water heater. He produced a small key from his pocket and opened it, and inside, arranged with more care than I expected, were several items I recognized immediately. The bookend I had used to smash the music box, still faintly stained along one edge, a folded black cloth I assumed had covered other mirrors before the one I dealt with, and a leather-bound ledger, thick and old, its cover soft with handling. He told me the ledger belonged to whoever held my position, going back further than either Marlene or himself could account for. A record of incidents kept not for the store's protection exactly, but for whoever came after, so that no one had to face the 7 rules with only a laminated sheet and their own frightened guessing. He handed it to me and told me to write down everything I had experienced so far, in my own words, in as much detail as I could manage, and to keep adding to it as long as I worked there, because someday, whether I wanted it to happen or not, someone else was going to stand behind that counter on their first day and need every page of honesty I could leave them. I sat with that ledger for a long time that afternoon before my shift officially started, reading through entries written in handwriting I did not recognize, some faded almost to illegibility, others clearly written in a hurry, ink smudged like the writer's hand had been shaking as badly as mine had been more than once. I found an entry from years earlier describing almost the exact scrape against the window I had endured, written by someone who had clearly survived it the same way I had, by refusing to look, by making themselves boring and blank until sunrise. Reading it did something strange to my fear, softened it slightly at the edges, because it meant I was not the first person to sit through that particular horror alone, and I was not likely to be the last, and there was something almost bearable about being one name in a long line of people who had made it through the night by following the same careful rules. I added my own entries that evening, writing out the flannel shirt, the mirror, the music box, the knocking at the door, the cassette tapes, the teapot, each in as much detail as I could remember. And when I got to the part about the teapot, I found myself wanting to warn whoever came me even more specifically than the original rule had warned me, wanting to describe exactly what the fluid smelled like, exactly how heavy the object became, exactly how long the scraping outside the window lasted, because I understood now that vague warnings save you only partway, and specific ones save you more completely. It was while writing that entry that I noticed something in the older pages of the ledger I had missed on my first read-through, a section near the middle written by someone who seemed to have worked the position for several years, someone who had clearly grown as familiar with the rules as I was starting to, and who had added a note in the margin that made my chest go cold reading it. The note said that the 7 rules were not fixed, that occasionally, rarely, an 8th situation arose, one that did not match any of the 7 known patterns, and that when it did, the only real defense was noticing early that something was wrong before it revealed itself fully, because by the time an unknown danger showed its whole shape, it was usually already too late to respond correctly. I thought immediately of the residue I had found under the taxidermy mount weeks earlier, the discoloration that did not quite match the description of Rule 7. That had seemed like an early stage of something rather than a full event. I brought the ledger to Marlene that evening and showed her the margin note and asked her directly whether she believed an 8th situation was something we needed to actually worry about, or whether it was old speculation from someone who had simply grown paranoid over years of doing this job. She read the note carefully, her expression harder to read than usual, and told me she did not know for certain, that in her own years running the store, she had never personally encountered anything outside the 7 known patterns, but that she had also never dismissed the possibility, and that the residue I had found under the deer head still bothered her more than she had let on at the time. She told me she wanted me to keep watching that corner of the store especially closely, and to write down absolutely everything, no matter how small, because if an 8th situation really was forming somewhere in this building, the only chance any of us had of surviving it cleanly was catching it early, the way the note in the ledger described, before it had the chance to become something none of the 7 rules could protect us from. I went home that night with the weight of that possibility sitting heavier on me than any single incident had so far, because at least with the 7 rules, however frightening they were individually, I knew the shape of the danger and the shape of the response required. An 8th situation, unnamed and unwritten, meant facing something with no laminated sheet to guide me at all. Only my own judgment and whatever I had learned from 6 months of surviving the things that already had names. And as I lay awake that night, I found myself hoping, more than I had hoped for almost anything else in my life, that whatever had left that residue under the taxidermy mount was nothing at all, some ordinary explanation I simply had not thought of yet, rather than the beginning of something the store itself had never learned how to survive. 3 weeks passed after that conversation with Marlene, and during those 3 weeks I kept my promise, writing in the ledger after almost every shift, watching the taxidermy corner so closely that I started noticing the exact grain pattern of the wood shelf beneath the deer head, memorizing it the way you memorize a face, so I would know instantly if anything ever changed again. Nothing did, not for those 3 weeks, and I began to let myself hope that the residue really had been nothing, Some strange but harmless discoloration with a boring explanation nobody had bothered to figure out. Then, on a Tuesday evening in late autumn, a woman came into the store carrying a small wooden box, plain unmarked, no visible hinges or latch that I could see from the counter, and she set it down and told me she wanted to donate it. And when I asked for her name for the receipt, she said she did not want one, and left before I had even finished writing the word declined in the log. I recognized the pattern immediately, the missing receipt, the quick exit, and my whole body went tight with the particular dread I now associated with unlabeled donations. I did not open the box right away. I set it behind the counter and finished the rest of my shift with it, sitting there unopened, and around closing time I finally examined it more closely, running my fingers carefully along its seams, and found no way to open it at all. No lid, no lock, no visible mechanism, just a solid seamless block of dark wood, heavier than its size suggested, the same unnatural density I remembered from the teapot. I checked the ledger that night, flipping through every page, cross-referencing every rule, every margin note, every entry from every employee who had come before me, and found nothing that matched a sealed box with no way inside. I thought about the 8th situation, the one Marlene and I had discussed weeks earlier, and standing there behind the counter with that box in front of me, I understood with a certainty that settled somewhere deep in my chest that I was looking at exactly that, something none of the 7 rules had ever prepared me for. I did not touch it again after that. I called Marlene immediately, and she came in within the hour, and together we stood over the box in the quiet store, and she admitted, for the first time since I had known her, that she did not know what to do either. We tried, gently, to lift the lid with a butter knife along every visible seam, and found none. The wood seemed continuous all the way around, as though it had never been built to open at all, only to hold something inside it permanently. Around midnight, while we were still standing there trying to decide what to do, the box began to hum, low and steady, not quite a melody, not quite a voice, something in between that made the hair on my arms rise. Before I even understood I was afraid, Marlene told me to step back, and I did, and we both watched from a distance as a thin line of light, pale and cold, began to show along one edge of the box, like the wood itself had started to come apart from the inside without breaking. I remembered, in that moment, something the margin note in the ledger had said, that the only defense against an unknown situation was noticing it early, before it revealed its full shape. And I understood that we were already past early, that whatever this was had been building quietly since long before that woman ever walked through our door, and that noticing it now, at the moment it was already opening, might not be early enough to matter. Marlene grabbed my arm and pulled me further back toward the front of the store and told me, in a voice steadier than I felt, that we needed to get outside, now, both of us, and I did not argue. We left through the front door together, out into the cold night air, and stood on the sidewalk watching the store through the glass, watching that pale light grow brighter along the seam of the box sitting on the counter, until eventually it filled the whole front window, with a soft cold glow that had no source we could explain. We did not go back inside that night. Marlene called Denny, and the 3 of us stood outside together until nearly 4 in the morning, watching the light slowly fade back down to nothing, until the store looked ordinary again, dark and quiet, the box sitting silent on the counter as though nothing had happened at all. When Denny finally went inside at first light, the box was empty, split cleanly down what turned out to be an almost invisible seam, and whatever had been inside it was simply gone. No trace left behind, no residue, no smell, nothing except the faint cold feeling that lingered in the front of the store for days afterward. The kind of cold that has nothing to do with temperature. We never found out what came out of that box, or where it went, or whether it had left the building entirely, or simply moved somewhere else within it. Waiting, patient, the way everything in that store seemed to wait. Marlene added a new page to the ledger describing exactly what we had witnessed, and she told me the 8th situation had a name now. whatever we decided to call it, and that whoever worked my position after me would at least have this one page to prepare them, even if it did not tell them everything. I still work at Secondhand Sun. I still follow the 7 rules exactly as they were given to me, and I still watch the corners of the store that once surprised me, though I understand now that surprise is simply part of the job, that no amount of watching ever fully closes the gap between what I know and what the store still holds. I keep the ledger updated every week, adding whatever small detail seems worth remembering, because somewhere down the line, someone else is going to stand behind that counter on their first night alone, and I want them to have more than a laminated sheet and their own frightened guessing. I want them to have every page I can leave them, every rule, every warning, every cold light I ever watched fade back into an ordinary dark, because the store does not stop collecting what people bring to it, and neither, I have learned, does it ever stop needing someone standing behind the counter who knows enough to survive until sunrise.